Okay, today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we actually already started at the beginning of the year because Chapter 6 is divided between populations and communities. So today our primary focus is going to be here on this community side. But just to review, if you remember our hierarchy of ecology, that first you start with one organism. A population is multiple individuals of the same species. A community is all the biotic things and how they interact, and that's where our focus will be today. And then ecosystem adds all the biotic and abiotic. Now you put everything together, and that's our biosphere, or the entire portion of our Earth, which is really the entire Earth, that contains living things. So, just as a quick review, our population characteristics, the things that we talked about in the past, were really the difference between size and density. And if you guys remember, we talked about density dependent factors, and those were things that had a bigger effect the more densely populated a group was. So things like disease that we're all figuring out now, the more densely populated an area is, the more likely a disease will be spread. Another thing that's density dependent that we'll talk about today is actually competition. Competition can be within one population, but also can be between two different species. Now, if we remember also that density independent factors were things like natural disasters that were going to have an impact regardless of how densely populated that area was. Now, we also looked at these graphs here that a population, again, this is all just one species, they tend to either be nearly uniform or clumped. Because remember, there's typically reasons for why populations orient themselves in space the way they do. So a uniform population would spread itself out to set up a territory and to reduce competition. And a clumped population would be one that might be clumped around a common resource, might be done for protection, like swimming in schools of fish, or might be done to hunt in cooperative groups. Now, very few populations are just random. These would definitely be more generalist type species that don't require a particular territory and can make do with lots of different types of resources. So a lot of times you might see weeds as an example of something that has a random distribution. Now, another thing we take a look at with population characteristics is the sex ratios. So remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the year, that having the number of females helps to determine how fast your population can grow. So one thing that we do look at that is how many males to females in a population. Now, this picture up here is an interesting picture. This fish right here with the white head, this is a blue-headed wrasse. It's hard to see, but the very tip of his head is blue. And he is a male, and this is a harem of females. So you typically have one male blue-headed wrasse with a lot of yellow female wrasse. So that's just one of the interesting types of sex ratios that we might look at. Now, another term in populations is this term metapopulations. So a population is really defined as one species that can interbreed. But a lot of times in today's world, we have populations that are separated geographically. And so technically they wouldn't be able to breed. But what we're starting to see is like this is a bridge in Canada where this is a highway that's running under the bridge, and they've created a green space or a corridor for individuals to be able to go from one side of the highway to another. Without this, these two populations would be separated and over time might be able to evolve into two different non-reproducing populations. But a metapopulation is one that can be connected by a corridor. Now again, this is just to review our different types of growth patterns for populations. This is unfortunately what we're still seeing with our virus, is this exponential growth, that it starts off very slow and then goes into this J-shaped curve. But eventually, even this virus will have to level off into logistic growth, because remember that everything is going to have a carrying capacity. Everything is going to hit that upper limit where things like predators or resources or space or food will lower that growth rate and cause it to level off. So here is that natural type of graph that we saw, that first you have that slow growth going into exponential growth, and that no individual is going to just level off at one constant carrying capacity, but it's going to go down and then up and down and up, so that carrying capacity is a kind of a fluid number where the numbers go up and down around that average. So now in community characteristics, one of the biggest characteristics that we look at is competition, because critters out there, they like to be able to survive and reproduce. And what they want to do is try to reduce competition as much as you can to preserve energy to be able to survive and reproduce. So one of the biggest things that they do is something that's called resource partitioning. So here this resource can be food, can be space, and partitioning here means to split it up if they can. So here's an example of barnacles, and these barnacles, they attach to something, in this case a rock, and they don't move. So here we have the brown barnacle that can live all the way from a very high tide line all the way to low tide line being submerged underwater. So they can live for a very large range. The gray barnacle can only be out of water for a shorter amount of time. So it's only to the mid-high tide range. So what happens is that up here in the high tide range, the gray barnacle would have to compete for space with the brown one. And down here, the brown barnacle would have to compete for space with the gray one. So what tends to naturally happen is the critters that were in this transition zone here would be going through competition and reducing their fitness. And so what happens is these gray barnacles kind of won out here, and they survive and reproduce in this range, whereas the brown barnacle kind of shifts upward because there's no competition up here. So it really makes it more available for them to be able to survive and reproduce. So they kind of split this resource up so that it can reduce competition. So this is a very common thing that will happen. Now, another community characteristic is symbiosis. Now, symbiosis means living together, and we have three types of ways that organisms live together, and I like to think of them with these smiley faces. So mutualism means they both benefit from this. Our classic example of this is our pollinators. The plants get to reproduce, and the pollinating insects or birds get to have a sweet treat. So they both help each other. Commensalism is when one benefits and the other's like, doesn't quite matter. So here, this is a good example of this rhinoceros and this bird on its back. The bird gets protection from the rhinoceros because if you're a predator of the bird, you're not going to go after it on this particular rhinoceros. And also the rhinoceros has some bugs on the back that the bird gets to eat, so it gets a ride and it gets some bugs eaten off its back. But the rhinoceros doesn't really benefit from that. The bird is very light, its skin is too thick for those bugs to really bother it, so the rhinoceros is not bothered at all, but the bird definitely benefits. And then the third one is parasitism, where one benefits and the other is harmed. Now, one important thing to note is that with parasitism, typically the host does not die, because that's not going to be symbiosis anymore. That's not living together. That would be more predator-prey. So with parasitism, any deaths tend to be accidental. But with parasitism, one definitely is harmed, but one does benefit. Now, another key community characteristics are keystone species. Now, keystone species are ones that if they are removed, the entire ecosystem will collapse. Now, where this theory comes from is the keystone in architecture. So if you can picture a stone entryway, you build up the sides of the stone entryway in arch, and at the very top, there's one stone that you kind of wedge in there, and it holds the whole entire arch up together. And if you pull that keystone out, the entire arch will crumble. So this is where we get this keystone species concept from, that if you remove this keystone species, then the entire ecosystem will collapse. Now, there's a few examples of this. These are kelp forests in California, and what you see here is when you have sea otters that love to eat sea urchins, the kelp is healthy. But when we overhunt our sea otters, the sea urchins, which is one of their main prey species, takes over. And sea urchins are herbivores, so they eat the entire kelp forest. So without the sea otters, the sea urchins kind of take over. So you see this whole collapse of the ecosystem without those sea otters. Now, weirdly, sea urchins, in another example, could be the keystone species. In the Caribbean in the 1980s, there was a disease that killed off about 98% of the sea urchins. And without the sea urchins acting as an herbivore, algae overgrew the coral reefs and you had humongous damage to those coral reefs. So it can be a case-by-case basis what will be that keystone species. But they can be predators, they can be a particular food for an important species, or they can be part of a symbiotic relationship or make up a habitat. Now, this really kind of speaks to the interconnectedness of ecology. So what we'll look at in our time together is this trophic cascade video. It is very kind of cool to see the interconnectedness. Now, the last thing that I want to end with is something called island biogeography. Now, this is a concept that looks how competition can really impact the diversity or the species richness of an island. So if you have an island, what you have to recognize is there's a balance between immigration or new species arriving to that island and then the subsequent extinction, because you can't have two species occupying the same niche. What you'll see is either that resource partitioning where they split apart like we talked about earlier, or one will go extinct. Now, two things that really impact this are the size of the island and the distance from the mainland, because we're literally talking about islands here. Think like the Hawaiian Islands. So if you have an island that is very far away and very small, what tends to happen is that you will not have a lot of immigration. But if you have a nearby island, that will have more immigration than a faraway island. And if you have a very large island, that will tend to have more immigration as well. So you both have the size of the island, you want it to be large, and the distance from the mainland, you want it to be close. And what that will do is that will allow for more immigration, and you'll have a higher species richness. But ultimately, what determines how many critters you have on this island is how many resources that you have. So if you have a lot of resources, what that's going to do is it's going to allow for a lot of generalists to be able to thrive on that island. Now, when you have this type of situation set up, any type of specialists are always going to be vulnerable to extinction because a lot of times when you have invasive species, those are going to be our more generalist type species who are very good at adapting to new habitats. So this is a big study that takes a look at the comings and goings of species on an island. Now, I do have a lab for you to practice this, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like, here we have two islands, and these are the species that are immigrating and emigrating. Okay, so if I have two species, I'll speed this up a little bit, of the same size and same distance, what we should see is a relatively equal number of species coming and going to the island. But if I move one island far away, I'm going to come to my data, I'm going to clear my islands, and what we see is that here island 2 should be easier to get to, okay, than island 1. So it's going to take a little while for this to even out. But overall, that distance should have an impact. Okay, so over here, I can see on my island 2, I am starting to get more species than on my island 1. And if I change the size and make that a smaller island, and I'll clear that away. So again, what we should see is that island 2 should be easier to inhabit. So up here, my island 2, I have much more species or a higher species richness. So I've developed a lab that helps you kind of play around with this because you can also change the different types of animals that you see. and play around with different types of habitats as well. So you can see all the varying